In this video, we're going to talk about controls, which you can build into your Excel file for the user to interact with. Generally speaking, not every user is going to be familiar with VBA, so you don't really want those individuals accessing your code when they don't understand it, and most of them wouldn't know how to run a macro anyways. So instead, we can build controls into the file for them to use. So for example, in my Excel file over here, if I go to my Developer tab and open up my Visual Basic window, we can see I've already inserted a module and I've pre-coded a little message box here. So I've called this subroutine hello message with the little message box to tell the user hello. And if you aren't sure how I created this, you can reference the videos on creating a subroutine and dialog boxes. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and give you a second to pause and copy all of this code if you want to follow along. Otherwise, you can just follow along on the video. So now let's go ahead and go back to our Excel file. Normally, to run a macro, we would go to the Developer tab, click on Macros, highlight the macro that we want to run, in this case hello message, and click the Run button. And we can see I get a little message box that says, hello user, your code has successfully run. And this is how we expect the system to behave, so I'll click OK. Now, with this method, you're expecting your user to have access to the Developer tab and understand how to use the Macros button, how to find the appropriate macro, and run that macro all from this window. You're also assuming that by giving your user access to the Developer tab, you're also giving them access to your Visual Basic, to all of your code in the hidden aspect of your database. And that's not necessarily something that you want to do. So instead, we can build in a graphical user interface, or GUI, which you'll sometimes hear referred to as a GUI. Now, this means that we can go ahead and use this Insert button under Controls in the Developer tab. Go ahead and click on this first button control here. We can see it says Button Form Control. And go ahead and just draw a big square on your Excel file. Now we're going to tie this to a macro, and this will make sense in a second, so just go ahead and click on the hello message and click OK. And we can see now we have a really big button that's appearing in our Excel file. Now, the form control that we just entered onto our Excel file, if we look in the Insert menu, this button is found under Form Controls. There's a different version of controls called ActiveX controls. Now, format controls are much simpler, and they're built into the Excel system itself. ActiveX controls are a little bit more flexible, but lots of the company systems won't actually trust the ActiveX controls, and it will disable them as soon as you open up the Excel file. They're also Microsoft specific, so they generally don't work on Mac operating systems. So as a general rule of thumb, you're going to want to use form controls to build your GUI rather than ActiveX controls. So let's talk about this button that we've just inserted. When I click on this button, it will automatically run my code for me. It's because we've tied our code to this button click. But let's say I want to select this button and I want to do something, say, change the text. To select the button, don't left click, right click on the button. And this will give you the option to edit the text, to assign a different macro, to change the formatting of it. So let's go ahead and change the edit text. And we'll change this caption to read message button. And we can go ahead and click out of the button, and we'll see that the text has been changed. We can also change the format of this, so we'll go down to Format Control, and we can see we can make this a superscript, a subscript, we can make things bold. If we wanted to go through properties, we can change what happens, the behavior of the button as you change things. So if you want your button to be seated in a particular set of cells, you might want to say move and size with cells, whereas if you want to just have your button sit on your screen and be totally unrelated to the cells, you can use don't move or size with the cells. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do to format your button to behave however you want it to behave, changing the size, changing the margins, all of that sort of thing. So for now, we'll click OK. We can see my text has become bold because that's what I just changed in my format. The last thing that you'll want to use if you right-click is Assign Macro. So if we click on Assign Macro, we can see it pulls this window back up. And this is that first pop-up window that we got when we inserted the button initially. And usually this will list all of the macros that are found in this workbook. So usually you'll have 2 or 3 different macros, and you'll want to be careful about which one you assign to which button. So in this case, If we wanted to change this to something else, you could open up this window, click on whichever one you wanted to tie to your button, and click OK to change it. So again, when I click on this button, we see my code has been successfully run. Now there are different types of controls outside of just the button control. There are drop-downs, ListBox, ComboBox, CheckBoxes. There's a whole bunch of different options that you can use in these form controls. So just as an example, let's just click on this checkbox and draw a little checkbox on here somewhere. And we can see it pops up. It says checkbox 3. We can click it. We can unclick it to check and uncheck this box. So this is a different way that you might allow your user to interact with your code. Generally speaking, if you're going to be putting things that are more complex than just buttons on your Excel file for your user to interact with, you're going to want to create a user form instead. And there are a couple reasons for that. The primary reason being a user form is much easier to control from the VBA window. So just to give you an idea of what that might look like, if I open up my VBA window, I can insert a user form, and we'll talk about all of this in greater detail later. But we can see that on my user form, I have the same set of controls. I can insert a text box here. I can insert buttons. You can insert whatever you want onto this user form. So it's the same set of controls. The difference between the controls appearing on your user form and the controls appearing on your Excel file is that these controls on the user form are a lot easier to tie direct code to. They act almost like ActiveX controls, which are the more complex controls that we were talking about in this drop-down window. So generally, as a rule of thumb, it's best to put only button, basic, simple controls onto your user Excel file to create your user dashboard. And those buttons can be linked to more complex data entry fields like a user form. So that's the best way, generally speaking, to set up your GUI. And the main thing that you need to remember is to use the insert button and use form controls. Right-click the control to assign the macro. So I will go ahead and talk a little bit about the ActiveX controls just in case you ever do have a situation where you need to use an ActiveX control. Let's go ahead and insert an ActiveX button on here. And we can see right off the bat this is already a very different control. When I've inserted this button, it didn't pop up and ask me what macro that I wanted to tie to this button like it did when we entered our form control up here. Now we can see this is also automatically activated design mode. And what this does is if I take this out of design mode, if this button had a command or something to run with it, a macro tied to it, when I click on that button, it would automatically run. When I turn on design mode, if I click on this button, it instead selects the button for me. So as we were talking about with this form control, we have to right click on the form control to pull up a window to interact with it. With active controls, you can turn on design mode, and instead of right-clicking them, you can just regularly click on them. Now, when we do right-click on this, we can see we have a properties option here. So we'll go ahead and click on properties. Now my properties window has popped up, and this is what it looks like. You'll notice this looks very similar to the properties window in our actual VBA window that we've interacted with a couple of times in the past. So we can see we can actually rename this button. We can change the color of this button. The caption is the text that appears on the front of the button. So we can change all of these different appearance options of this button. It is a little more in depth than just a regular form control button like we looked at earlier. The other thing we can do when we right click on this, we can view the code that's tied to this button, and we can actually put code directly into this window. And this would be tied directly to our button that's appearing on our main front sheet here. So this is a little bit different than the form control where we pre-wrote the code and then came back through and tied it to the button. If you use ActiveX controls, you can insert the button first and then tie code and build it into this button click itself. So it is a little bit different. It's a little bit more complex. And this is actually how most of our user form controls are going to behave. And so we'll talk about that when we go through user forms. But just in case you ever do need to use an ActiveX control for whatever reason, this is how they would behave. This is how you would interact with them. And of course, you would want to remember to turn off design mode whenever you're done building your user interface. So again, in this video, we talked about controls, we talked about active controls and form controls. We talked a little bit about user forms, which we'll discuss more in a later video. And generally speaking, we decided if we are building a graphical user interface into our Excel file, it's best to use simple form controls like buttons for your user dashboard, and then put the more complex controls like your ActiveX controls into a user form or some other method of interaction for your user. And again, we'll talk about user forms more in a later video.